laptop?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you, yeah, precisely. And is that going to be a level? Is there something that the laptop will sit on, or is it your hands that's holding it?
On my knee at the moment.
Okay. So just, if you can keep it really steady, because it,
Yeah.
when the viewer sees the
Right.
rocking back and forth. So, well, I was emailing Michael. Okay, great. So we'll talk for about 10 minutes or so,
Okay.
and then we'll just take the best parts and get this ready to run at pub date.
Okay. Very good.
So, and it's sort of like radio. I won't really interrupt you, but we're looking for sort of short answers. So tell me, did you come across the idea for this book when you were researching another book, or had you always known about this sort of contentious and odd relationship between Truman and MacArthur, and now was the time to write about it? Or how did you come to this story?
This is one of the first stories that I discovered when I was a graduate student back in the early 1980s. And in fact, I did a research seminar paper on what is one of the highlights of the book, the emergency meeting between British Prime Minister Clement Attlee and President Harry Truman, that had been prompted by Truman's suggestion that Douglas MacArthur might have his finger on the nuclear trigger. So I knew about that story, and I knew it from way back. And I didn't do anything more with it at the time. But after I had written a series of biographies, the last one, most recent one being on Ronald Reagan, I decided I wanted to do something that was not strictly a biography. Biographies have a rather fixed genre, a fixed form. And your subject is born, lives, dies. And you kind of follow the story along. And one of the things that I became increasingly, I won't say exactly distressed about, but I became increasingly aware that when you write a biography, though you struggle against it, you cannot help but present the story as though your subject is at the center of the universe and everything revolves around him or her. And that's simply not the way history works. So I wanted to tell a story. First of all, it wasn't as long as somebody's life. I wanted to tell a story that was really short in time, but intense in drama. And I wanted to have two poles to tell the story around rather than a single pole. And I remembered the story about Truman and MacArthur. And it was a very appealing story because they were both very powerful personalities in their own right. And they were struggling over a central issue of American foreign policy. I was reminded in doing the research that this is sort of the forgotten nuclear crisis of the Cold War. When people think Cold War nuclear crisis, they think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and for very good reason. But in some ways, this was more dangerous because it wasn't something that was played out between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was played out within the American government. And it also hinged on a fundamental aspect of American constitutionalism. Who is it who sets American foreign policy? And do military leaders have to take their orders from the elected civilian officials? And constitutionally and formally, the answer is yes, but it took Truman and his advisors a long time to come to the belief that they could actually enforce that. Douglas MacArthur was this celebrity. Douglas MacArthur far outranked Harry Truman in the minds of most Americans. Not according to the Constitution, but politics is different than constitutionalism. Right. And the other thing I wanted to do was, when I was writing biographies, I would do my best to give the arguments of the opponents, the foes of my subject. But given the fact that you're writing about this one person, you can't give as much time to the critics and the opponents as to the protagonists. But in this case, I had two protagonists. Maybe they're both antagonists. But in any event, I can give them an equal amount of time. And furthermore, they both had compelling arguments. Now, eventually, the country had to choose between the two. And I did my best, and I think I did a pretty fair job, showing the world through MacArthur's eyes, showing the world through Truman's eyes, and showing what happens when those two worlds collided.
Right. And Truman was a more sort of, I guess, sedate personality. But I mean, MacArthur, kind of bombastic. I'm just being a journalist. I'm curious what you think about whether MacArthur would be able to get away with that kind of behavior today. I mean, in other words, does the press and the tools that journalism that we have nowadays, it's so easy to track someone. It's so easy to see them making a mistake. If there's an audio blip or clip that accidentally gets out, would MacArthur have been able to get away with this kind of behavior?
I think MacArthur would have been able to get away with it better today than then. Well, MacArthur was a master of the media of his day. He could play journalist. He understood the power of radio, the emerging power of television. The speech that he gave after he got fired, relieved by Truman, when he came back to the United States and gave this address to a joint session of Congress, was the most compelling speech that anybody in that room had ever heard. And it was carried by radio and by the emerging television networks. And there was not, MacArthur had his live audience and his media audiences wrapped around his fingers. They were crying when he wanted them to cry. They were cheering when he wanted them to cheer. There were all sorts of people who thought that if the Republican nominating convention had been held at that particular moment, he would have been the Republican nominee. If somehow the Electoral College had met at that moment, he would have been swept into the White House. And it was a terrific moment, but it couldn't last. And one of the reasons it couldn't last was that MacArthur had been too long away from the United States. And this was what he thought was an encouragement to go forward, was really a celebration or reward for what he had done in the past. So the people who cheered for MacArthur were really looking at MacArthur as the victorious general of World War II, who was coming home for his first visit home after the war. And this is what it was. Instead of the opening shot in a campaign for president in 1952. And he confused those two, in part because he'd been so long out of the United States. He had very little sense of the American political temper. And in fact, he lost the 1952 Republican nomination to another general who did have his finger on the pulse of American culture in a way that MacArthur didn't.
Yeah. There's a passage that I want to read to you. It's on page 202. And you write, Atkinson had learned of the order only because MacArthur's air commander had notified his service superior, who relayed the message to the Undersecretary of Defense, who sent word to Atkinson. So that's and it's prompted me to really wonder what the research for this book was like. I mean, as you said, you have two protagonists. Did you find that information just from Atkinson's memoir and it was easy to put that in the book, or did you have to track down every little step of that?
Well, first of all, because, and this is the benefit of being a historian when you're studying a controversial subject and the people involved loathe one another because they do their best to get their side of the story out. So early on, actually I said that Atchison's memoir was not published until the late 1960s. And so he more or less kept his peace for almost 2 decades after the event. MacArthur told his story about 10 years after the fact. But this is one of those moments that's far enough back in American history that all the pertinent documents are now available. And so I can see the cables that are going from MacArthur's command headquarters in Tokyo to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And then what the Joint Chiefs of Staff say to the Secretary of the Army, to the Secretary of the Air Force, and so on. What they say to the Secretary of State, what goes from the State Department and the Defense Department to the White House. So you can follow this trail along. But one of the striking things about all of this is that everyone, from the President through the Joint Chiefs of Staff, through the Secretary of State, was intimidated by MacArthur. And if MacArthur had not gone, if he had not kept pushing, he would have gotten away with everything. And the reason for this was these men understood, and they were all men, they understood that MacArthur was politically invulnerable until he finally crossed the line. And there's good reason to believe, I can't prove this, but I certainly can surmise that MacArthur deliberately pushed this to the breaking point, that he wanted to get fired because he wanted to come home and be able to run for president of the United States. He had already run twice. Now, without taking off his uniform, during World War II. he launched a campaign that didn't go very far against Franklin Roosevelt. He ran against Harry Truman in 1948. And in neither case was he willing to give up his military position to run. So he ran like George McClellan did during the Civil War. Keep your uniform on, maintain your military commission and run. And if you win, then you got a new job in the White House. If you lose, you still got your old job. But MacArthur was over 70 years old in 1951. And he realized that the only position that was higher than what he had already held was President of the United States. And so I think he deliberately pushed Truman to the point where Truman had no choice but to fire him. And then he could come home and he could campaign against Truman as this war hero who, amid this emerging and increasingly tense Cold War, knew better than the President of the United States what American national security required.
Mm-hmm. And so what are you working on next?
I decided to jump back to the 19th century. I go back and forth between the 20th century and the 19th century. The 20th century is pretty familiar ground. I've been over it from the time I was a graduate student until now. I've lived through a substantial portion of the 20th century, which is a sobering thought. And there's an attraction to that precisely because it is familiar. But a little bit of the lack of attraction is that it's too familiar. One of the appeals to a lot of people, including me, of history is that it should be a little bit exotic. So if you could imagine yourself back in the moment you're writing about, you don't want it to look like the streets of New York today. You want it to look, well, it could be ancient Egypt or it could be 19th century America, where at least they're wearing short breeches and riding horse and buggy, that sort of thing. So I'm writing a book about the three most powerful and charismatic figures in American politics in the first half of the 19th century. Three individuals who become senators: Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. They had careers that almost identically overlapped. So they entered the federal government around 1811, and they all served to the early 1850s. And to track their careers, it allows me to do this sort of duopoly that I did with Truman and MacArthur, but make it a triopoly. And so I get to triangulate things. And their lives intersected with all the important figures and all the important events of that early time. The other thing is, this takes us back to a time when political oratory, this was the golden age of American political oratory. And I mean, not only were the speeches really good, but they mattered. Today, you can go watch speeches from the US House and the US Senate, get on C-SPAN, and people are standing up there giving talks. But C-SPAN has this rule that the camera never pans, because if it did, you discover that the chamber is empty. This person is speaking merely to the camera, and what the person says has no bearing on anything. Decisions are made elsewhere. But when Henry Clay gave a speech, when Daniel Webster gave a speech, people changed their minds. And this was the high form of political entertainment in those days. I have to say that I shudder when I consider a speech by Daniel Webster that went on for 2 or 3 days and compare that with Donald Trump's Twitter feed. There's something that's been lost there. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing. And I'm wrapped up in it, and I'm absolutely fascinated.
Okay.
And sometimes people ask me, so what's your favorite book? And the answer is always the one I'm working on right now.
Of course. Great. Well, this is perfect. This gives us good material, and we will edit this down and get it ready for pub date.
Excellent. Thanks, Todd.
Congrats on the book.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Talk to you later. Bye.